Okay, great.
Okay, well, everybody, welcome to this talk today. And before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to our student assistant, Danielle, to do the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Marika. I would like to welcome you all to the University of Calgary and the Department of Classics and Religion, and to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Paraspa, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. Danielle is one of our new majors this year, and we didn't even give her a chance to breathe before we got her hooked into everything we do. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Claude Eilers to talk to us today, and we're really grateful to have you here. I'm going to start with a quick reading of your biography for those who haven't seen the poster. Claude Eilers completed a BA at the University of Saskatchewan and an MA at McMaster. He wrote a doctoral thesis at Oxford under the supervision of Barbara Levick on the theme of Roman patrons of Greek cities, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2002. His other publications include an edited book on diplomats and diplomacy in the Roman world, Brill 2009, and articles on Josephus's use of documents, a subject on which he is preparing a monograph with the tentative title, A History of a Dossier, Josephus and the Evolution of Jewish Privileges. He's been at McMaster since 1995, where he's an associate professor teaching mostly Latin and Roman history. He was a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in 2000, and Blegan Distinguished Fellow at Vassar College in 2005. And I personally love Josephus, so I'm very much looking forward to this. And so with no further ado, I introduce Claude Eilers to you, and he's going to speak to us on a docket in Josephus.
With a question mark.
Yes, with the question mark.
and I just need to make sure for the last little run that that I've got my stuff here. I've got some water, a little tip for the young'uns. In my first job talk, that is, I was interviewed for a job at a university that will go unnamed, at which, you know, and this is one of the lessons for you, always make sure you know where your water is, because as I was doing the, you know, the turning of the papers or whatnot, I caught the water glass and it spilled all over my paper. Well, I didn't get that job. But it didn't, you know, it didn't, I guess, turn out to be too bad, because I'm very happy here. So today's theme, and so I'm going to do a paper kind of the old style. So today I'm going to be talking about Josephus, who many of you may have bumped into once or twice. He's a somewhat complicated figure, born into an elite family in Jerusalem. He became an important figure in the politics of Judea in the time of Nero. That is, in the time leading up to the Great Judean Revolt. Once the revolt broke out, Josephus found himself cast into a leadership role, and when his sector was overrun, he was captured. He was able, however, to make himself sufficiently useful to the Romans that he was not only eventually freed, but he was also given Roman citizenship and eventually an apartment and pension in Rome, where he turned to writing about the war, the history and culture of his people, and the vicissitudes of his own career. The two of his works that we're going to be dealing with mostly today are the Bellum Judaicum, which I'll just call the Bellum, and which recounted in 7 books the history of Judea from the mid-2nd century BC until the conclusion of the Jewish War in about 70 AD. And his second work, the Antiquitates Judaicae, which I'll just call the Antiquities, appeared a couple decades later, describing in 20 books, so a much bigger project, the history and culture of his people from creation to the outbreak of the revolt. The Bellum and the Antiquities then cover a lot of the same cover a lot of the same ground. So for the Hasmonean period, that is the period when Judea was under the leadership of the Hasmonean family, that is from about 160 BC down to the 30s BC. This same narrative is described both in the first book of the War of the Bellum and in books 13 and 14 of the Antiquities. And in many places, as you can imagine, they are quite similar to one another. Indeed, often the Antiquities seems to be little more than a close paraphrase of the Bellum, with the result that with any deviations between them stand out, as you can see, for example, in handout number 1, where we describe the events of the first half of 47 BC. A little context for you. This is describing, both passages are describing how after the Battle of Pharsalus in 48, Pompey, as you'll recall, was defeated there. Hope I didn't have a spoiler alert there. He was defeated, he fled to Egypt. Caesar pursued him and arrived only a few weeks later to learn that Pompey had been assassinated on the beach as he tried to land. And then Caesar became entangled in a quarrel between Ptolemy the 13th, the last king of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and his elder sister Cleopatra the 7th. Yes, that Cleopatra. And the result was that Caesar ended up being besieged in Cleopatra's palace over most of the winter. It was not all hardship. Caesarion, whom Cleopatra claimed was Caesar's son, was born the following summer. Ultimately, however, Caesar was rescued by a hastily recruited force of allies that included a contingent led by or sent by the Jewish high priest Hyrcanus II, the last but one of the Hasmonean high priests. In the aftermath, while proceeding through Syria on his way back to Rome, Caesar stopped and rewarded Hyrcanus and his aide-de-camp Antipater, who was father of the later King Herod, in two accounts that you can see now in handout number 1. And I hope, I'm going to be bouncing around in the handout, so I hope you've got your own PDF of it. It can we'll be bumping around, and there are some passages you may want to look at specifically. Okay, so, and I'm not going to go into presentation mode largely because I find that I lose too much that way, and so I'll just, there's not too much animation, you know, there's one animation, but it probably shouldn't be a problem. Okay, so up to this point, Josephus's two narratives, the Bellum and the Antiquities, really do proceed in lockstep, and both continue to describe first how Caesar heard the appeal of a rival to the high priesthood, which he rejected, and then what he did specifically for Hyrcanus Antipater, which are summarized there for you in handout number 1. These aren't the actual text, these are just summaries. And as you can see in both of them, Hyrcanus is judged to be the more worthy candidate to be high priest. Antipater, in both of them in very similar language, is offered any job he wants, and he says, no, I can't take, it's for you to decide. Caesar makes him epitropos, which should mean something like overseer. Then permission is granted to Antipater to rebuild the walls of the city. which had been knocked down. That's the Bellum. In the Antiquities, it's just a little bit different. Permission is given to Hyrcanus, and the walls are said to have been knocked down by Pompey, which I think everybody had assumed was the case. And then 200 of the Bellum instructions are sent that the honors, hautai timai, be recorded on the capital, and then, frankly, it's pretty much the same. So these things go pretty closely. There are some minor differences. There's a famous book by Richard LeCure that kind of collects these things and it makes I think a decent argument, but not quite decisive, that in the interim between Bellum and the Antiquities, Josephus had second thoughts and had thought and decided that Antipater was a little more important than he had originally written. But apart from that, they are really identical, except for once you get to the end of this passage, and then there is a long digression. And if you look in handout number 3, you'll see the entire text. But so we have these 199 to 200 here, and then 143 to 144, and then beginning in 145, we have a documentary digression that only exists in the Antiquities, and you can see the whole in all its glory and translated glory in handout number 3. But I'm going to sketch it out for you. So 144, these things are sent to Rome. Caesar sends these things to Rome, which is identical, basically, to pretty close to identical to what is in the Bellum. And then we have, and the decree enacted by the Senate went like this. Then for a few paragraphs, we have the Senatus Consultum Valerianum, a decree of the Roman Senate that acknowledges the arrival of envoys, hears their request for some local intervention, accepts their gifts. It's a really fascinating document, especially in that Josephus cannot be, or in my view, Josephus cannot be right about the date of this document. It clearly belongs to about the year 140 BC. It's very similar to something that we find in First Maccabees. And then at the end of this, at 148 BC, he offers these things happened, tauta agenita, under Hyrcanus the high priest and ethnarch in the 9th year in the month of Panemos. Then he pauses, introduces a decree of Athens. There is what we call a docket, and that's basically what we're talking about in this paper, dockets, but not this one, recording the delivery of this Athenian decree to a Greek city that happens to be Pergamum. Then we have got a decree of Athens honoring not Hyrcanus II, whom Josephus, I think, clearly assumes is the honorand of this inscription, but Hyrcanus I. It's a decree of Athens, and so of course it's dated by an archon and has a very elaborate fixed formula in the decree that dates it absolutely securely to April or May 105 BC. That is, there is actually no way around that. There is no more secure date in all of ancient history than an Athenian archon date in a period that we know well, and this is one of them. Anyway, so after that one, Josephus sums up and said, well, all of this is enough. I've shown you how Hyrcanus was honored by both the Romans and the Athenians. And then he picks up his narrative. Caesar leaves Antipater and escorts him. And then the Bellum and the Antiquities proceed more or less in lockstep. So I've just laid this out for you in handout number 2. And one of the things I want to bring your attention to is what here is Josephus's words versus what are the words that he's quoting. So obviously the narrative, Caesar sent these things to Rome, that's Josephus. And when he says, and the decree went like this, that's Josephus. The decree, of course, is quoted. Then the date, these things happened under Hyrcanus. that I think we need to argue about, and that's actually what this paper is about. Then, of course, he introduces the Decree of Athens, and this is clearly Josephus again. He's introducing a document. He quotes the docket of a document and the document, and I'll get to dockets in a second. And then, those are quotations, and then clearly he's summing up in 156 and then back to his narrative. So the real question is, what are we going to make about this here, right? Whose words are these? And on this question, there really has been no scholarly consensus. There are some who believe that these are Josephus's words. There are some who believe that these are the words of some intermediary source that have kind of crept into his text. And then there are some people, and here I'll draw your attention to handout number 5, who describe this in a number of ways in all of the conference languages, including Latin, ab archi curatoribus adjectam, added by the curators of the archive, and then various opinions that are saying this is some kind of archive notiz, Roth, or archive Vermark, Gauger. And then in English, it's usually described as either an archival notation or an archival note. And then Zolshan makes the entire, all the assumptions clear when she says this is an archival notation made in Josephus. And what date is this 9th year? Well, the collection of dates that people have supposed for this is actually pretty impressively diverse, ranging from 135 BC down to 46 BC, the year after this narrative. And well, let's get to it. So now, as you may have noticed in your handout number 5, the terminology of what this thing is, the tauta agenita epi Hyrcanus is a little bit unfixed. And I'm going to make it even more confusing for you by kind of resurrecting a good English word that is actually the word for this is docket. It's fallen mostly out of use in modern English. It survives in judicial context. We speak of the judicial docket, which tends to be the schedule rather than the items, but it's etymologically related to the word ticket. Right, and it is a description either on the outside of a document, like in a package, or at the top of a document that describes what the document is. Now, you might ask, well, what does a docket look like in an ancient context? And I think if you've asked yourself this, you should congratulate yourself, because you're at least, I think you're one step ahead of all of these scholars who've, I think, kind of embraced the idea that this is a docket without really going and finding any for themselves. And, just a methodological side note for those of you who are beginning to do research, if you have something that is explaining something, you should know as much as you can about that. Now, as it happens, we have a very good example of a docket in Josephus himself, and not merely in Josephus generally, but in this very documentary digression. And so if you look at your handout number 8, this is right above the Athenian decree. So Josephus says in the decree of, introduces the Athenian decree and then quotes it. He thinks this is part of the decree, but it's not. And it goes, in the year of the priest and Prytanis Dionysius, son of Asclepiades, on the 5th day before the end of the month of Panemos, delivered to the strategoi a decree of the Athenians, and then a decree of the Athenians follows. This is what a docket is, and this is what is added in this Greek city when it's delivered. And as it happens, we know this is Pergamum. I thought I was very clever. It took me about a month to work this out. You know, the formula of Greek cities is very specific. Each of them will have its own eponymous formulae, etc. And the only city that has the eponymous formula of Prytanis and priest, we got a lot of eponymous priests, got a lot of eponymous Prytanes, but the only place where this specific formula is used is in Pergamum. And in fact, Pergamum has the month of Panemos. Athens, for example, doesn't. Every city has its own kind of version of the Greek calendar. Asclepiades, this guy is the son of Asclepiades, and it's the name of one of Pergamum's most important families. The strategoi in Pergamum play an important role in the constitution, so we're not surprised that this would be delivered to them. And so this is what a docket should look like. And, you know, what are its features? Well, a date is prominent. Right, we've got a date, a year, and a month, and a day. We've got also a report that it's delivered to the strategoi, and a description, a title. Now, why these details? These details are really about the practical needs of the receiving archive, right? This document needs to be filed. It needs to be filed according to a system. If it's ever going to be, found in an archive, which, you know, probably is the size of a small library, it's going to be needed to be found there. And so we've got a title, we've got a date. The archive is clearly organized chronologically. You know, there's a shelf that's a year, sorry, probably a bookcase that's a year, a shelf that's a month, and then maybe a box for part of the month, right? And, you know, the thing is, this isn't our only docket. We actually have other examples of this. I've spent sort of a lot of the last year trying to collect them. They, as you can imagine, kind of disappear into their documents because this part here looks so much like a decree prescript. A lot of Greek city decrees, if you've had a chance to see them, will start with a date. And, you know, kind of one of the telltale signs that you've got a docket is you have a decree from somewhere else with, you know, that is the match isn't there between where the decree is from and what the dating formula is. And the data, so the decree might be from somewhere else and the dating formula from somewhere else. So we've got actually another really good example of a docket in your handout. Let me clear that. In your handout number 9. Now, one kind of inscription that we find in the Hellenistic period are honorific inscriptions for dikastai, for judges, really like foreign arbitrators. That is, when a city has an internal problem that it can't be, you know, its internal politics prevent it from adjudicating fairly to all parties, they will invite someone they'll invite a neighboring city to send them judges to arbitrate the affair. And then we have like maybe 150 of these, where then the city will honor the judge after the business is done. And this is one that survives from the small Greek city of Lebedos. And we have a copy of this from Lebedos that starts there at Oxante Boule, etc., that tells how they had sent an ambassador to Samos for judges. Samos had sent them, the judge had done his business, and then so they passed a decree, inscribed the decree, and of course it's important to remember not all decrees are going to be described, but they did inscribe this, and we have it. And then of course they did something that's not surprising. They sent a copy of that to Samos. They sent a copy of that decree to Samos because it was honoring both Samos and its judge. And Samos also inscribed it. And so we have two copies of exactly the same decree, which I think is just the most amazing coincidence. And there's a lot of interesting things about this. And one is they are obviously clearly the same decree, but they're not perfectly alike. You know, they're happy enough to, you know, rearrange a clause, adjective in front of a noun, adjective after a noun, just like we've all been learning in Greek is fine. And so the only significant difference between the two, though, is at the top of the Samos decree, we have what I've underlined here, which is a really nice docket. Right, and it reads, you know, in the year of Menedotus, in the month of Poseidon, on the 5th day from the end, in a regular assembly, Apuleius, son of Apollonides, presided after taking a legal oath, and then the title, Decree of Lebedos. And then they have exactly the same text. What is this thing at the top? Well, this is another docket. And as with the Pergamum decree that we've just considered, a local date is prominent here, eponym and month and day. And then there are other details as well, that an assembly met, and it was a regular assembly, an ecclesia nomia, the name of its presider, a statement that the presider had taken a legal oath, and then this title. This last detail, I think you want to note, is key. Without it, one would have no way, almost, of being able to figure out where this thing came from. Greek city decrees don't refer to themselves, you know, the demos of a Greek city decree refers to itself as ha demos, or us, hemas. Never actually is it the demos of the Athenians. You know, the demos of the Athenians as a formula is only used by other people when they're referring to the demos of the Athenians. So this last detailed decree of the Lebedos is an important one. And again, I think if you use your imagination, you can see that, you can see how this might work as a docket, right? And so, you know, both of these two examples, I think you can see hopefully the pattern. Now, every decree is going to handle itself a little bit differently. Every city handles its business differently. Every city has differently named, well, not every city, but cities have their own names for magistrates. Cities have their own names for their eponymous officials. Samothrace, and this is interesting, I just noticed this the other day, the name of the eponym in the eponymous official in Samothrace is King Basileus. So you'll find, you know, when things are dated, it's in the year of the king and then a name, but the king changes every year. Every city has its own month system. Every city, you know, has its own way of, you know, it'll be year then month then day, or year then day then month, and so forth. But there are a few features that I think are consistent of dockets, and one is a date that is being used to file. And the second, a title that allows someone to know what they're looking at in the archive. This isn't about what's inscribed at this stage yet. Yeah, we know them all from inscriptions. But this is about the archive, and what you want in an archive is somebody to go to, be able to go to the shelf, have a reference that gets them to the right document, be able to know that that's the right document without handling it too much, and then the document is recovered. And, you know, in fact, in some ways, this is, I think, a little bit like, you know, library spine, you know, spines of books in libraries. And this is from my house. And every day you know, on my way out the door, I go by a bookshelf, and this particular book, this translation of Josephus, is there at eye level. And I want to point out to you, you know, have a look at what is there. And I want to point to you, we can say some things about the organization of the library that this was once in and has been pulled out of, right? What's 1951? You know, that is the year that this book was acquired, clearly. But if you want to find it, you go to the 1951 room or shelf or whatever. It's reference, and of course it's next to, you can just see barely probably there that these two books, the two volumes, have the same reference, and one is 1 and one is 2. But what does this number tell you? Well, I think it probably tells you that, in fact, they've been sequentially numbering the books as they come in, right? So if you had to find this in a library, you'll go to the 1951 room, or, well, 10,000. They might have started at 10,000 for all we know. But this is, you know, going to be between 10,645 and 10,647. So I think you can see that there are some regular features. Another, I think, important thing to note is that when, you know, when verbs are used, you know, when verbs are used, it's about the functioning of the archive. So, you know, in that Pergamum decree, the say phisma that is attached is delivered, epidothe. And, you know, we have a letter of Nero in Rhodes that in its docket speaks about this letter having been sent, right? Copying is probably the most common. In Samos, we have oath-taking. I'm guessing that what this is about is that the procedure in Samos of accepting documents happens in an assembly. Things are delivered to the assembly, and the presider at you know, in that meeting will declare an oath that, you know, on deposit, that this was a genuine that the document that is there is the one that was delivered. So what are the elements of a docket? Well, almost always a date that's by the system of the receiving archive, and that's about organization, just like our my translation of Josephus there, 1951 year, in a different, you know, in a different library or archive, one might imagine, year, month, day. There might be some further details. What is this about? Delivery to the strategoi. Probably, I think we should imagine that in that case, the strategoi have a section of the archive. So this is from the strategoi section, year, month, day when necessary. But, so a date, that is a filing reference, a title. One of the things about all of these things is they're placed at the top of their documents. What's that about? Well, you actually don't want your archivist to have to handle a document more than he needs to in order to find exactly the right book. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but you're working in a library and you've got a file number. Not all books actually have a title on the spine, but you can see the books that don't. They get pulled off and opened and put back because somebody's gotten the wrong one, and they get worn out. All right, and then sometimes there's some kind of verb of archiving, and here is the Greek of the passage we're thinking about, and the question is this a docket? Okay, it's got a date, but could this date be by the receiving archive? Of course, the year is according to the 9th year of the high priest and ethnarch Hyrcanus. One could imagine that the archive in Jerusalem, which is really the only place one could imagine would use a date by the high priest. That's fine, but Menos Panemu, this is a Macedonian month, and there is a Jewish calendar with its own dates, its own month names, and this, I think, is not going to be something we would find in a Jewish archive. They will date by their own months if they're arranged that way. And then there is one piece of evidence that does suggest that that their archive was more or less organized like a Hellenistic city-state. But date according to the archive, not very easy to see that. There is no title of the received document here. That is, if this is a docket, would you be able to tell that you had the right document? No, not, of course, fatal, because we really, with Josephus, shouldn't assume, especially something like this, that we've got a complete text. It should be placed at the top of its document, and it's not. It's placed below its document. And then it says, the verb here is tauta agenita. These things happened. And that's not archival language. What things happened? The things that happened in the decree happened in this year. Nobody's going to write that. That's not going to be a docket. Docket is going to say this was received, etc. And I'll get back to that as a question. Shortly, but really the only thing about this that looks like a docket is that there is a date, and it's not much of a fit, but it is a date, and you do what you can. But its mix of Judean year and Macedonian month is not very helpful. And I hope it's occurred to many of you, I'm sure, that dates do appear in other contexts, especially in ancient historians, and actually in Josephus more than most. So let's continue, because I want to point out to you some dates in Josephus. So here at the top is the text that we're trying to compare, tauta agenita, epi, Hyrcanus, etc. And, in 11,183, the first example, this is how Josephus brings to an end his description of Xerxes' refoundation of the temple. Tauta menun epi Xerxu agenita, or at 933, after a description of how the king of Judah, Amaziah, had kind of bungled a military campaign and cost himself the kingship. Tauta egenita in the 3rd and 10th, in the 13th year of the kingship of Amaziah, or again at 422 about the battle of a key battle under the Maccabees. Te niken sunebe genesthai tautain. So note sunebe geneste. Sunebe is just basically a synonym for genita. These things happened to happen. This victory happened to happen, or rather, sunebe, it happened that this victory happened in the 13th year, and in the month that among the Jews is called Adar, and among the Macedonians is called Distros. All right, now notice there how Josephus actually will sort of translate when he's got a foreign, rather than replace a foreign date, at least here, than replace them. Or in the Bellum, tade un eprakthe diumenos ogdae, right? These things were done, eprakthe, and again, basically another synonym for egenita, in the month of Dios on the 8th, in the 12th year of Nero, 339, in the 13th year of Nero, on the new moon day of the month Panemos, and then finally at Bellum 667, Tauta un trite menos. Now, those of you who read the Bellum, the war, may have actually been struck by how much Josephus likes these dates. In fact, the entire narrative of the campaign from about book 2, this one that I've cited here isn't the first, but there's a run of about 38 dates. He will describe a certain series of events and then say, this happened on this date, and then he's taking great pleasure in these dates. 4 days later, and then a description, and then this happened on this date. And there's a run of 38 of them that basically kind of governs this. And so, I kind of want to suggest to you that this is not a docket. And that's the question mark in the title. Obviously, whenever you see a question mark, here's another little tip for you. Whenever somebody puts a question mark in a title, they're arguing against it. Is this a docket? No, it's just a date. And then, of course, if it's just a date, does it help us date that document that it follows? No, it's not a date for that. What is it a date for? And I think if you look at this in outline, Caesar sent these things to Rome. Then we've got a bunch of dockets. Sorry. Then we've got the introduction and inclusion, and then these things happened. The these things and the these things happened is not the document. It's the moment that Josephus has attached the document to. And what is the date? Well, the date has to be 47 BC. Josephus seems to think that he's talking about 47 BC. Clearly, I mean, he's done this narrative. Now, this doesn't actually solve all of our problems, because Josephus throughout this work is talking about Hyrcanus and describes his various vicissitudes of becoming high priest, losing the high priesthood, regaining the high priesthood, etc. He describes his career in 2 different places, and there is no way, I think, that we can make this text work. And I have a suggestion that I will share with you very quickly and then conclude. Or maybe I didn't. No, in the end, I didn't share that with you. but many scholars have approached this particular problem and just decided that this passage is corrupt. As it happens, this can't be his ninth year being high priest, because we know at this point he's been priest almost 30 years, and Josephus knows that he's been priest almost 30 years. The problem is complicated by the fact that Josephus describes, in summary, Hyrcanus's tenure in two different places, and they're not consistent with one another. In places he says, describes it in a way that would lead one to believe that Hyrcanus had been high priest for 33 years at the time of his, at the time he was overthrown. And another place he says 40 years. So the solution for this particular problem of that number is different, but whatever that number is, I think we have to assume that Josephus thinks he's talking about 47 BC. And I will leave it there and turn it back over to the chair.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So we'll give everybody a minute to think. And if you've got questions, please use the reactions button to put up your hand so that we can see you, or you can put them in the chat. Just give everybody a minute to think for a second. And while they're thinking, I'm not even sure I have a question, but I guess I'm thinking about the amount of corruption in Josephus, and has that been put forward as any kind of solution over the years for this passage?
Yes. I mean, the thing is that the Antiquities is one of the most textually the most problematic things that we have from antiquity. And in the Antiquities, there's no bit of the Antiquities that's a bigger mess than Josephus's documents. And so, yes, I think it is true. Many people assume that this is corrupt, and many people assume that this is corrupt. And basically the proposals, that is, once you say it's corrupt, you only say that when you think you've got a solution. The proposals usually involve adding a period on the front of 9, right? 9 and 20, 9 and 10, so 19 or 29. But those aren't actually easy to make work either. One of the problems here is that, any number, 9 or 19 or 29 are 9 years, every year is 9 years away from something. Except in the ancient world, where it's 9 years away from 3 different years, right? Because you can be counting inclusively, you can be counting exclusively, you can be counting, and then of course, when you're talking about regnal dates, how do you count that? The first bit of the year, do you count the first full year? And then once you're there, you can just kind of pull, and you kind of get the sense that people are squinting hard and turning the math just like this I mean, I have kind of two solutions. One is I think the 9 here, shouldn't be the 9th year. I think it was the 9th day. It was the 9th day of the month of Panemos. And what had happened was the number of the year had originally preceded Anatu. And then a mechanical error or copy error meant that was lost. And then there was a need for a year, and somebody just kind of overread 9th to 9th. And that has the advantage of being acceptable, whatever your preferred chronology of the history of Hyrcanus is. You can put anywhere, any year you want there. And then my other solution is, I think it almost works, but again, you have to squint and, turn the paper a little bit. I mean, one of the weird things is, from Josephus's narrative, you wouldn't know that Hyrcanus had ever become ethnarch. He doesn't mention it at all in the Bellum. and and it only really appears here in this tag, in this docket, in this non-docket, and in the documents he quotes, it's quite common. We got like 6 or 8 in the times in the docket, in the documents. So the idea is, I mean, the only place. I mean, there's a lot of variables here, but one of the things is that Josephus's work, the Antiquities, came with a table of contents, summaries at the beginning of every book. And over the last few decades, as he's been doing his edition of it, the French scholar Naudet has been arguing that these summaries are not an ancient table of contents that were extracted from a finished work afterwards, but in fact are an outline that Josephus made as he prepared to write. And in fact, I think if you get into the weeds of the problem, it's a very, very difficult conclusion to avoid, simply because there are things that are in the summaries that are right, and that we want to believe Josephus believed, that in some ways are not, that is in the end, he doesn't write what's in the table of contents. That is, he makes different decisions than are there. And so it looks like he just kind of let these things circulate with, and it's there. But one of the things that is there is the table of contents says that Pompey, when he conquered Josephus, that it was Pompey who gave Hyrcanus the title ethnarch, and it's just completely clear there. And so it just seems to me that in this rewrite, Josephus had originally thought, this will be a detail I include, and then didn't do it. But if Pompey gave him if Pompey gave him this title, and then he lost it under Gabinius, and then Caesar gives it back, I think if you count that up, and with the eye of faith and the wrong number of fingers on one hand, it almost works that could be a ninth year. But that, the thing is, once you're there, once you're doing this, the thing is, it's got to be not only arithmetically true, I think it's got to be historiographically true. We've got to believe that Josephus would do this. So, which is, I think, well, I don't know, with Josephus you can believe almost anything, I think. But surely somebody else has a question.
Lisa.
Great. Thanks for your talk. I was just curious in terms of the parameters you're setting up with with the dockets for date, title, placement, etc. To what extent are the legis actiones of Roman law actually formulating how he's approaching the use of language there?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Josephus here is quoting, for these dockets. These dockets had been inserted at various points, and almost all of these are, from the point of view of almost every specific city, or most specific cities, are pre-Roman. That is, so Lebedos, this is probably about 200 BC.
But even, but just thinking about the nature of the language itself, in terms of, because you're trying to suggest this notion of docket and legal language per se, but trying to filtering that out through Josephus's own time and knowledge of court and action. Is that?
I think probably not.
Okay.
That is, how to put it? Josephus is a very, I think, in some ways, Josephus is a great quoter, in that I really don't think he's doing anything with these documents apart from quoting them. It's very, very difficult to show that they had any influence on the text around them. That is, here you could take a razor out of this digression, and if it weren't there, nobody would know that it wasn't there. So I don't think that he is, I don't think he has any idea that this passage is a docket at the top of the Athenian decree. It's just part of the decree. Now, there's a larger theory here of where did he get these documents and in what form, as he collected them one at a time and then given us an undigested thing. I think my conclusion, or the explanation that best explains the evidence, is that he's gotten a big whack of documents, like you know, a scroll of 30 documents that look more or less like what we see here, and in there's a big dossier of documents coming 10 pages later, and he has more or less, I mean, he's divided them up and inserted them in different places in his narrative, but he's not done very much with them in terms of, you know, and yeah, every once in a while it looks like he's tried to smooth the style a little bit, you know, added "de" to the second word of some new document, just because, you know, it seems a little bit jarring to start without one. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea that, you know, I mean, what does Josephus know? I would think in some ways Josephus's problem is almost the opposite of what you suggest. That is, if you think about Polybius or Sallust quotes documents, or you know, other historians quote documents, Thucydides does. These are men who've grown up in a Greek city that has a culture of documents and archiving, etc. You know, they will know, I mean, they won't recognize the form of a prescript, but they'll know that's a prescript. They'll see that the parts of, you know, Josephus grew up in a completely different system. I don't think he, you know, part of the reason why I think his handling of the documents sometimes seems so amateurish is because he really is an amateur. He's not, you know, Polybius grew up in this from the time he was old enough to be watching what's going on in public. You know, his world was full of these documents. These are all new to Josephus. So I don't think he's got any sort of sense of the, you know, of what these things are. I mean, the thing is, it's some of the documents have information in them that contradicts his narrative, and he doesn't seem to pick up on that. So yeah, I mean, but thanks. I mean, that's an interesting question.
Other questions? John. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence of an early editor, not long after Josephus's time, somebody who took over his work from him and tried to work through it systematically and reclassify and correct the original?
You know, probably not. I mean, the thing is that, you know, that as you all probably have bumped into, the idea that there is, you know, the idea of publication in ancient Rome and Greece, but we're talking about Rome, you know, is a complicated one. You know, that is, there is no moment of publication like there is for us. Sometimes documents are circulating with or without an author's permission. In Josephus' case, there seems to have been official text. He mentions that he sent a copy to the emperor, which seems to suggest that that was done. But there are some signs that there was a second edition, and not impossible to imagine that these documents are part of a second edition. Now, whether or not that was, well, that would have been Josephus himself. And then the thing is, once it's out there, it's going to have a life of its own. Mm-hmm. And different people are copying it under different circumstances. There are some signs that there was a different version of this circulating. And so for those of you who are interested in such things, there is an early Slavonic translation of Josephus that in some passages is completely different. And that has led some people to suggest, well, maybe, you know, maybe that is actually a different edition than the one that we've got, and something was rewritten in one version or the other. I think it's usually assumed that the Slavonic version descends from an earlier text. But yeah, the thing is that, the whole question's a complete train wreck. The manuscript is the manuscript tradition, at the largest level, at this level, is complicated. At the micro level, there are long passages in the documents that don't have, that'll have, for one name, four different names that are clearly corruptions of something that could be. So it's, the thing is, it is a real mess. But yeah, and boy, I think we all wish that somebody had come along and cleaned it up afterwards. Mm-hmm. But probably not.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Just can I just ask probably a very stupid question that follows up on that, though, but is Josephus, do we know anything about earlier historians he may be using, or is this all straight from him? Like, yeah. I'm thinking about like the textual problems around the word Christ or Christus in Suetonius, for example. And I'm just wondering.
Yeah, one of the things is, it's a long running dispute, between people who have a low opinion of Josephus and those who have a higher opinion of Josephus as to what his relationship is with his sources. But if we're talking about books 13 and 14, that is, of the Antiquities, it's pretty clear that for the first part of this, he follows the first Maccabees quite closely, and you can see this. Okay. He has some supplementary information that he adds in. And then at some point he stops and starts using what everybody assumes is Nicolaus of Damascus. Nicolaus of Damascus was a minister of Herod's, a counselor of Herod's, and in his retirement, he wrote a universal history in 144 books. And that Josephus at more than one point says, if you're interested more in X, go read it in this place in Nicolaus. And so it looks like he's followed Nicolaus quite closely through this passage that surrounds these documents. But I think the documents themselves didn't come from a literary source. I think that's pretty clear. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that they're shockingly undigested. And one can, I think, believe that these documents could pass through one historian undigested. But, the thing is, I would want them to be, and nobody else would do that. One of the things is this thing that Josephus is doing here, and these are only two documents, but in the next year, he stops and says, and look at these ones, and there's 24 documents that he just basically dumps there. And we've got nothing else like that up to this point. That is, Thucydides quotes a treaty or two, and Polybius quotes, 3 treaties between Rome and Carthage, but he doesn't do it like this. He doesn't do this dump. And I don't, I think that's got to be Josephus. And what's the reason? I think he's just embarrassed by it, or rather, he's got too many documents. If he had one document, he would have used it intelligently. But because he had so many documents, he's just kind of dumped it there. And I think hoped that it impressed us. And it is impressive because, I think there is a secret history there's a lot in these documents that, there's a lot of things about these documents globally that has become ossified in the scholarly discussion. Josephus is an overwhelmed graduate student. That's exactly right. He's completely overwhelmed by them. and he just dumps them. But it's a good thing because there's, yeah, as I was saying, the understanding of these documents was, I think, was ossified before anybody knew anything about documents. So, you know, one of the things that that I've been trying to write my monograph about, and I hope someday I'll finish it. But I've been at it for 20 years now, 20 some years. So, you know, there may be some of you who are younger than the first draft of this book. But, you know what, the thing is that that there is, a lot of them need to be redated. The documents are difficult to date. People assume that the date that Josephus has, you know, that the date is where Josephus inserted them. But if these things had come out of an excavation, there is no, like this Senatus Consultum Verularianum, if this had come out of an excavation, you know, people would think you were crazy if you thought that it came from 47 BC. There would just be no way anybody could believe that. You know, if you know, if this part of Josephus were a peer-reviewed article, you know, the editor wouldn't have even sent it to referees.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I mean, it also raises questions about Josephus's, you know, where he comes from, and you know, because I'm thinking, and then I'll stop talking because I'm sure there are other questions, but I'm quite interested in this. But I'm thinking about some of, you know, similar kinds of things that I've seen in some of the Syriac sources and sort of the Near Eastern traditions and the Jewish traditions of sort of throwing all the documents in and you sort it out.
I'd be interested to connect with you on that sometime.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's because there's more of that. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Anybody else? I'm just talking the question period. I'm going to stop now.
I have a question, actually.
Danielle, yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned near the beginning of the lecture that all the Greek cities kind of had their own system of dating. So I was just wondering, how would you be able to get accurate dates that, like, we would understand when things happen based on our current dating system?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And in some places it's doable. And so, for example, for Athens, and part of the reasons that you know, they've been able over the last century, scholars, to reconstruct pretty much a complete list of the archons for the years, for every year, is you know, the formulae are so fixed, and magistracies rotate. There's a rotation. So sometimes you'll have a little block that's you know, that says so and so. You know, one way you'll do an eponymous dating is saying, you know, the Dionysius who was after Meta Bob. You know, that is, and then, you know what, the thing is, you've just got obsessive, super smart people who've collected all the data and put this enormous puzzle back together. And then at some point you might have a fixed date. A good example of it is, in fact, we have a run of eponymous dates in a large inscription from Ephesus that basically is a list of the people who oversaw a certain annual games. So we've got the name, his name, and then the eponymous date, and then, you know, the you know, formula that said hosted these games, and we got a wall that is this list of all of them. So 40 years running of the people who hosted games and the eponymous year. And then, in fact, one of those dates we happen to have in a different inscription a reference to that date being the 10th year after the victory of Caesar, you know, at Actium, and then that kind of brings the whole 40 years into things. But it's an enormous, complicated, mind-numbingly boring exercise that you're glad that somebody else figured out so that you don't have to. And it's like been a century, like it was about a century, you know, mostly it was settled for Athens, but in many other places, yeah, we have no idea. This Dionysius, who is Dionysius, a son of Asclepiades, when was that? No way to know, really. Must have been about the same time as that Athenian decree, probably the same year. So you would say, because we can date the Athenian decree, we assume that that one is the same year. But yeah, it's a mess. And then every city does it differently. Could they handle this in the ancient world? And this is, in fact, I think what you ask is a really good question. Question is, could Josephus have dated these documents that had this information in them if it had occurred to him to try? You know, and it wouldn't be an easy thing, right? Because, yeah, probably you could do Athens and Rome, but you know, there's a lot of places he gets things really wrong, right? You know, places a document in the wrong place because he thinks he recognizes a name of a Spartan king, but puts it in the wrong place. So there's a lot of ways that can go wrong, and I don't know. I think we should feel some sympathy for him. He was completely out of his element. You know, that is, he probably, you know, if he read, I'm not actually even sure he's read these things, but if he read this, you know, this formula for the docket from Pergamum, if he read that, would he have known that that was a docket? I doubt it. Would he have recognized that this is an eponymous date with a month, etc.? But we have another question, Carolyn.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I apologize for arriving late, and you may have addressed this in the beginning of the paper, but I'm really intrigued just by the historical document of the docket, you know, the historical worth of that. And I'm a medievalist, so I'm not really up on the early sources before, let's say, the year 1200. But I was wondering about the accessibility of dockets. Do they survive in this, besides in the inscriptions, but do they survive in any kind of number?
I mean, thank you for raising that. I didn't mention that. Kind of let's divide a couple. I think we've got a handful of them in Josephus. As I think there are 3 in Josephus. The one I was talking about is not one. There's a lot of them in papyrus, and there the rules are a little bit different depending on the period, because you'll have a roll and the docket's on the outside, right? And so you'll have like a date and a description. And in fact, we have an edict from, I forget which Ptolemy, that changes the rules about this and describes the form that dockets should take. And then we, you know, that is, we actually can see at that point in a certain species of documents this rule being followed. But for inscriptions, they're a lot rarer. And if you think about, you know, every public inscription, every public document that is received into an archive has to be docketed. Otherwise, it'll be lost. There has to be a system. So if you think about this, every inscription that we have erected probably had been docketed at one time. But I've spent, you know, that is, there is only one description of one kind of collection of here's the dockets I know. The great Louis Robert wrote an article on this inscription from Lebedos, and he said, here's a dozen. And so I've spent the last year looking for them, and it's a little easier with computers, of course, but I've got about 30 now. Yep. But, and you know, the thing is, I think this, you know, this template that I've said, you know, has to have a date, but, you know, has to have a filing reference, and the filing reference is always a date. Has to have a title, and there's only one exception. Letters don't need titles, right? Because the opening line of any ancient epistle is, you know, so and so to the demos, to the magistrates in Boule and demos of a city. Greetings. That formula is as good, you know, as good as a title needs. But apart from letters, you need a title, you need a date. There might be some other things that probably we should assume are archival. But most of this is edited. Most of these things you can see why are edited out before an inscription is made. Or actually, what's often typical is this last bit that titled, say, Phisma Athenaion, the decree of the Athenians. An awful lot of foreign decrees that they're coming from outside a city will have a title like that at the top of them, and which probably means that, the preparation is you take the docket, you tell a Labicide, don't worry about this stuff, start inscribing from here. So yeah, we don't have very many of them, and I mean, as you can see, it's very easy to lose them into the documents they're attached to.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was a great question. And as you can see, I'm now rather into dockets and can talk about them forever. But
Great. Wonderful. Are there any other questions? We have a few minutes left if anybody's got something. I can hear my dog being very bad behind me. I'm like, don't look at the. Right. If there's no other questions, I think it's up to us to thank Claude for this absolutely fascinating talk. I've learned so much, and I have so many more, so many more things I'd like to talk to you about. So anytime.
Well, let's do that.
Yeah.
And it was really nice to meet you. And I'm sure we'll cross paths again, probably.
Absolutely.
I hope at the Classical Association of Canada meetings. Yeah. And by all means, if you see my face, and there is only one person who looks like me, introduce yourself, and let's. I'd be happy to meet you all.
Awesome. And can I just ask, if people want to listen to your Latin songs on YouTube, is it just under your name?
Yeah, actually, I think the one I'm proudest of is called Third Declension Anthem.
Nice.
I could sing it for you now.
Okay. It'd be a lovely way to end this.
Arise and learn the third declension. Its nouns have gender number case. Rex, regis, regi, regem, rege. The plurals begin reges. Regum, and ibus, ace, and ibus. Thus we must the king decline. Make sure to memorize the genders, because adjectives may not rhyme. So come fratres, sorroresque. The tempus comes at last. Without the third declension, there is no libertas. No virtus, no honor, no pax, no veritas. Without the third declension, there is no libertas.
What a wonderful way to end the lecture. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all. And the thing is, as I was describing before, I've got like 35,000 hits on the Third Declension Anthem on YouTube, and you've got a problem when sort of famous scholar wrote me and said that they loved the song. I'd obviously much rather them write to me an email and say they liked my article or my book on patrons, for example. But
I don't know. I think that was perfect, and what a great way to to end today. So
okay, and there's also the first declension song, like the third declension song. That's that's the revolutionary one. The first declension's a little more bourgeois, right? It goes. Everybody's working on their cases and endings. Come on, baby, do the first declension. Start with fama, fami, fami, famum, and fama. Come on, baby, do the first declension. Fami, then famarum, famis, famas, famis. The plural and the singular, 5 cases apiece. So come on, do the first declension with me.
Awesome.
Okay, well, it was great to meet you all. And,
All right, everyone have a wonderful weekend, and thank you so much for the lecture.
thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Right.